Hello, I'm Annie Larkin, Vice President and Director of Community Engagement of the Amerind Museum. Welcome to Education Beyond the Mesas, Hopi students at the Sherman Institute, 1902 through 1929, with Dr. Matthew Sakayestawa Gilbert. Before we begin the program today, I want to acknowledge that Amerind is located in southeastern Arizona, on lands where O'odham, Hopi, Oshwe, Yoeme, and Apache families have lived for untold generations, and whose wisdom and traditions live on today in vibrant communities. We are grateful for what all of these communities, rich in history, have to teach us. Thank you to our program sponsor, Desert Island Casinos, as well as our members and donors who enable Amerind to provide free online programming and fulfill Amerind's mission to foster and promote the knowledge and understanding of the Native peoples of the Americas through research, education, conservation, and community engagement. To learn how you can assist Amerind in supporting its mission and programs by becoming a member or donor, please visit amerind.org. On Saturday, October 8th at 11 a.m., Amerind will host the free online flute performance with Vince Redhouse. Please visit the events section of Amerind's Facebook page or website, amerind.org, for registration details. Then on Saturday, October 22nd, Autumn Fest will take place at the Amerind Museum in Dragoon from 10 a.m. until 4 p.m. Please visit the events section of Amerind's Facebook page or website, amerind.org, for more information. I would now like to introduce today's guest. Dr. Matthew Sakayestawa Gilbert is professor and head of the Department of American Indian Studies and professor of history at the University of Arizona. He is an enrolled member of the Hopi tribe from the upper village of Munkapi. Centering his focus and teaching on Native American history and the history of the American West, he examines the history of American Indian education, the Indian boarding school experience, and American Indians and sport. In addition to publishing articles and books on Hopi history, he has produced a documentary film, Beyond the Mesas, on the Hopi experience at off-reservation Indian boarding schools, including Sherman Institute, Stewart Indian School, and the Phoenix Indian School. And if you would like to ask any questions during the program today, please type your question in the Q&A chat box, and we'll gather those to share with our speaker after the presentation. Also, a link to the recording of today's program will be sent to all of our Zoom registrants via email later today. Along with the recording, you will also have a link where you can buy a copy of the book, Education Beyond the Mesas. And with that, I'd like to welcome you, Matthew. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, thank you very much. It's a privilege to be here. I had given a lecture for Amerind on Hopi long distance runners back in 2020, and I'm just thrilled to be able to present more on my research. I want to thank, of course, Annie Larkin and the staff, including Eric Cardinal, at Amerind Museum for this opportunity and for the good work that Amerind is doing in Indian country. I had some previous experience working with Amerind Museum, which is not too far, of course, from my location here in Tucson. I worked with Amerind Museum on an indigenous runners exhibit and just had a wonderful experience working with the museum on that. And then for a year or so, I served as one of the board of directors. And I think it was when I served as board of director that I really began to see the museum from within, and to see the good work that the museum is doing, not only to promote Native studies and the rich culture of indigenous people, especially here in the state of Arizona, but also to promote Native people themselves. If you were to look at the number of speakers as part of this series, you'll see just an incredible number of Native speakers, Native scholars, Native artists, and community individuals, including some of my colleagues, Mary Jo Fox, and also Kelsey John, who recently gave a talk. And so I see myself presenting as part of a larger group of Native people, and I'm thrilled, of course, to be here. to talk, give my talk, Education Beyond the Mesas, Hopi students at Sherman Institute from 1902 to 1929. I'd like to first just begin by orienting you all, my audience, as to where the Hopi Mesa, where the Hopi ancestral lands are located within the larger state of Arizona. This is a map that certainly demonstrates that, but it's a map that a well-known sculptor by the name of Neil Logan drew for me for a book that I'm currently working on called Modern Encounters of the Hopi Past. Neil is a relative of mine on my mother's side. He's married to my mother's cousin, and he is for many years as his profession. He's been a sculptor. He works with bronze and other metals and other materials. And if you know a sculptor, you would know that they also are pretty good at drawing because they have to conceptualize their sculptures first in their mind, and then they draw it out, and then they create it with various different materials such as bronze or clay or stone. And I had commissioned Neil Logan to do a number of drawings for my book on Hopi long distance runners called Hopi Runners Crossing the Terrain Between American and Indian that the University Press of Kansas put together. And so he did a number of drawings for that. And as I mentioned, I commissioned him to do various different drawings for my current book project. But I thought I would at least start with this map so that you can see where we're talking about here. One of the themes throughout the work, my work over the years of my career, has been this idea of movement and migration of Hopi people. I'm always interested in learning about and discovering the various different ways that Hopi individuals throughout time, but specifically for me, mostly in the 20th, early 20th century, how these individuals who may have started out at Hopi in their various different villages migrated in the 4 cardinal directions, which is the migration symbol that you see there on the left-hand part of the screen. And I looked at early on when I was studying the Hopi boarding school experience, I saw the Hopi boarding school experience as a second wave of Hopi migration. Hopi historian Loma Ishi, who has passed away recently, I think it was last year he passed away. He was a professor at the Northern Arizona University, and I want to give him credit for this because he was one of those individuals, a mentor of mine, who talked with me about this idea of migration and looking at the boarding school experience and that whole era and time that the Hopi people went through as a second wave of Hopi migration. Of course, the first wave being way back in time, long before European contact, when the Hopi clans of long ago migrated in all 4 cardinal directions, experienced new lives in different regions, including way down in Mexico and central Mexico, and then returned with knowledge and skills. And so as a Hopi individual, I always thought of that idea as migration. And here I'm going to be telling the story of the Hopi people and these Hopi children in the early 1900s who were sent out sometimes by force on these forced migration to these Indian boarding schools because the federal government wanted them to be assimilated in American ways. And they went to Los Angeles, they went to the San Francisco region, certainly the Phoenix or Albuquerque, as you see some of those arrows in the distance and the miles in that map. And they return home changed individuals because you can't go to an off-reservation boarding school. You can't go to any school without being influenced and changed in different ways. In early, or it would have been the late summer of 2003, I was a new graduate student in the history department at the University of California, Riverside. And I was just starting my MA degree program. And part of the process for new graduate students in the history department at UCR was before the start of the semester, you needed to spend some time with your graduate advisor to talk about your course of study, not only for that year, but for the years that followed in your MA and PhD program. Well, by default, there was an individual, a faculty there at UCR who still teaches there by the name of Cliff Trafser, who's of Wyandotte and German ancestry. And I remember meeting with Cliff Trafser. I remember meeting with Cliff in his office on campus. And I had come to UC Riverside to study German intellectual history. I wanted to study early modern European history, but specifically German intellectual history. And I had taken courses at Cal State University Northridge and with a well-known historian by the name of Michael Meyer, German historian named Michael Meyer. And while I was taking these courses at Cal State Northridge, I really got interested in this German philosopher of the early 1800s by the name of Johann Fichte. And I started reading his writings on German education and his philosophies of German education and how it fit and transformed and changed the larger German nationalism at that time. And I had always been interested in education history, but taking a course from Professor Meyer at Cal State Northridge really got me interested in it. In fact, I even took German classes at a community college. I think I took a whole year, 2 semesters worth of German, and I was just all set. I was ready to go. I was going to study with Randy Head at UC Riverside, and didn't really think much about Cliff Trafser, to be honest with you. I knew he was a native historian because I had looked him up on the internet before I met with him. So Cliff and I had this conversation. It was about an hour long. We talked about the courses I had taken in previous schools or previous studies. He talked about the courses I needed to take that semester and the semester after that. He wanted to put me on a plan because I was going to become the next great early modern European historian. And about an hour into our conversation, he looked up at me and he says, "You're Indian, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes, yes, I'm Hopi Indian." And he says, "I know that. I knew that because Cliff had read my file. He was familiar with my admission file." And he looked up at me and he said, "There's this school that's not too far from campus named Sherman Institute. And it was an off-reservation Indian boarding school that the federal government had created in the early 1900s. I believe it started in 1902 to assimilate American Indian people into Western ways of living and Western society." And he says that he mentioned to me that while he had other students before me or in the past do work on Sherman Institute, including Gene Keller, who wrote a really fascinating book on Indian student health at Sherman Institute. He says, even though some students have worked on it, nobody has written about the Hopi boarding school experience. No one's written a dissertation about it. This would be all new research and new material. And then he talked about how there were just boxes and folders and photographs and other kinds of really interesting materials at the Sherman Indian Museum, which is it was the old administration building for Sherman Institute, but now it's a museum. They have these incredible collections. He says, there's so much material there on Hopi students at Sherman Institute. He says, you could write. Have you ever thought about writing a dissertation on that topic? You could be the one who tells that story. And that was a real eye opener I think pivotal moment, not only in my life, but my career. I had come to UC Riverside to study early modern European history, and that would have been fine, and that would have been great. I would have been, hopefully, I would have been interested in that for the long term. I don't, I was planning on having a career about that. But when Cliff Trafser said, you as a Hopi studying about your own people at this school, and being able to tell that story in a meaningful and a powerful way, that really got me thinking. And I just remember after that conversation driving back to Redlands, because at that time I lived in Redlands, which is just north of Riverside, and thinking to myself, oh my, I'm going to change my program. I'm going to go from early modern European history to US history with an emphasis in Native American history. Here I thought I was going to study Johann Fichte, just some German philosopher, and now I'm going to study Hopi. And I just remember being so excited about that. And my remaining time at UC Riverside included doing this vast amount of research, not only at the Sherman Museum, but also at the National Archives, which at that time was in Laguna Niguel, California, but then also working with the Hopi Tribe Cultural Preservation Office. And I remember one time I had went out to Hopi and met with Lee Kwan Wisioma and Stuart Koyum Tiwa, who Stuart is now the director of the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office. And I remember Stuart's describing the Hopi boarding school experience as a living history. And he went on to explain that these stories, right, this history still is meaningful for Hopi people today. That is, we have a connection to that, and we still feel the consequences of that history, both good and bad. Of course, I also have a personal connection to Sherman Institute. And when Cliff said to me, there's this school, Sherman Institute, down the street. Of course, I knew, I was familiar with that school. I didn't know a whole lot about that school, but growing up in Flagstaff, the Mountain Community Flagstaff in Arizona, I had long conversations with my family, even at a young age. My grandmother would often talk about her father. My grandmother is Ethel Sakayestewa Gilbert, and we're just so blessed that she's, I believe she's 91 years old and living up in her home at the village of Upper Mancopine in Tuba. And I just was able to visit with her not too long ago, and she would tell me when I was a young age about her father, Victor Sakayestawa, and how he was among the first students to attend Sherman Institute in the early 1900s. The photograph that you see in front of you is a real meaningful photograph for me. And this would have been taken in the it would have been taken in the late 1970s, probably around 1978, maybe 1979. I would imagine. And it depicts 5 individuals. And these 5 individuals in many ways represent who I am, right? And and my family and my relatives, and also my connection to Sherman Institute. On the far left is my great-grandmother, Aniseta Tachias. On my mother's side. So she's my great-grandmother. And then as we make our way from the left to right, this is Victor Sakayestewa sitting down on my couch with his hat on. And then we can continue on to the right, in between 2 individuals there. That is, and I put it on the caption there, that is a very young Matt Sakayestewa Gilbert. I'm thinking I was about 3 years old at this time. That's why I say I was very young and handsome, Matt Sakayestewa Gilbert. And I must have been about 3 years old at this time. And I'm looking, it looks like I'm looking at my grandmother in the chair. I'll come back to that. And then as we continue to make our way down the couch, right, is my great uncle Mo Sakayestewa. And then my grandfather, Lloyd Kwatsi Gilbert. And my grandfather Lloyd, Lloyd on the far right, he also attended the Phoenix, he also attended boarding school, he attended Phoenix Indian School. And when he arrived at the Phoenix Indian School in the 1940s, he arrived with his Hopi surname of Kwatsi. Kwatsi in Hopi means friend. But it was a common practice during that time, 1940s, 1950s, especially at certain schools, including the Phoenix Indian School, that they would change your names. They would get rid of your Indian names. And so they told him and his siblings, who were also down at the Phoenix Indian School at that time, to get rid of their Hopi name, their Hopi name, which is it's part of their identity as who they are as Hopi individuals. So they got rid of Kwatsi, and they chose the surname Gilbert, which is an English name, but it was also the first name of my grandfather's father. And so they chose that, and that's, I think, one of the tragedies, right? I always tell my students whenever I talk about the off-reservation Indian boarding school experience, it's not all good, but it's not all bad, right? There's various, that experience has various layers of meaning for Native people, and that's one of those, I think, one of those tragedies that Native people, not only did they lose their language and they lost a lot, right? And we'll talk a little bit about this in the slides to come. They also lost their surnames. Some of them lost their names, their Indian names, just in general. So this picture represents who I am on my mother's side, on my father's side, and it's one of the few photographs where I am with my grandfather, my great grandfather, Victor, and I think in many ways he was the inspiration. In fact, I write that in my book, Education Beyond the Mesas, that he was the inspiration for this book, because I had the opportunity, studying with Cliff Travisser at UC Riverside, to not just tell the Hopi story from one of many Hopi perspectives, right? But to tell his story, and to find documents at the Sherman Indian Museum, letters that he had written, or newspaper clippings about him, and to be able to take his student file, which I eventually found in the National Archives, to be able to take that back and hand it over to my grandmother, his daughter, and to other members of our family. I just looking at this picture of me as just this little kid, just being mischievous, I think. I've got a hammer in my hand. I don't know if you can see that. There's a hammer. I hope it's a plastic hammer. And my guess is that I was probably going around to everybody sitting down on the couch and my grandmother, and probably tapping them on their kneecaps. I'm sure that's probably what I was doing. When I was at UC Riverside and doing research on the Hopi boarding school experience at Sherman Institute, of course, that story doesn't begin at Sherman. It doesn't begin in Riverside, and also doesn't begin in California. That story, that history, the good and the bad of it, begins back home. It begins out on our ancestral lands. It begins in our villages. Victor Sakayestewa, my family comes from the ancient village of Arabi, out on Third Mesa. And there was, when you think of Arabi during the late 1800s and early 1900s, you need to realize there was a lot of tension that existed in this village and throughout the Hopi community at this time. And the tension resulted, or came from the federal government imposing their understandings of education, imposing their culture um, on the Hopi people. And one of the areas that created a lot of tension among Hopi individuals and Hopi people and government officials and Hopi people and Christian missionaries at that time centered on the topic or the larger concept of education. There was a lot of tension out at Hopi at this time on education. And I've always made sure I mention this whenever I talk about this topic or the boarding school experience, that the Hopi people were never against education. They were never against education. They valued, and we continue to value education. We have our own ways of knowing and teaching and values within Hopi society. But what the Hopi people were against at that time, at least many of them, was this imposed Western education on their communities. And these Hopi parents refused or did not want, many of them did not want the federal government to take their children away from their communities and send them to these off-reservation Indian boarding schools. Some parents willingly allowed that. Other parents were forced to do that. Some parents just absolutely had no say. One of the things that I want to kind of emphasize within this talk that I'm giving today is how children, right, the most vulnerable individuals in any society, how children were affected by this off-reservation Indian boarding school experience. You can imagine that in the village of Arabi and other villages out in Hopi land, that this would have been a very confusing time for the children, for these kids. They saw and heard their parents and uncles and grandmothers and grandfathers and aunties arguing with each other or with people from other villages, or maybe they saw their father, upset at government officials at that time. And these children were caught in the middle. They were caught in the middle of all of this. And it ultimately came to a head in late September of 1906, which is commonly referred to, an event commonly referred to as the Arabi Split, where the federal government had taken advantage of tensions out at the village of Arabi. And those families that were willing to accommodate or send their children to government schools stayed at the village, and those that didn't want to were essentially forced to leave the village, up to 500 of them or so. And they established the village of Hotbella as a result of that. There was a chief in the middle of this by the name of Chief Tawakwaktiwa in the village of Arabi, who to a certain extent, I think was accommodating and working with government officials at this time. But then government officials turned on him, and they got upset with Tawakwaktiwa because he had forced these quote unquote hostile Hopis. These were terms that government officials had given the group who went to Hotbella, how he had forced them out of the village because they didn't want to send their kids to school and sent them to Hotbella. And so they turned on Tawakwaktiwa, and they gave Tawakwaktiwa an ultimatum, essentially. And they said that you can either go to jail or to prison, and more than likely that prison would have been at Fort Leavenworth in Kansas, possibly even Alcatraz Island, but probably Fort Leavenworth in Kansas, or you and a group of Hopis, mostly from the area, mostly from Arabi, could attend Sherman Institute in Riverside, California. Well, you can imagine Tawakwaktiwa. He didn't want to go to prison. He had a family, he had kids. This was not something that he had wanted to do. I also feel that he probably felt betrayed by the federal government at this time, and he chose not to go to prison, but he chose to go to Sherman Institute in Riverside, California. And those children of the quote unquote hostile families the government officials sent those kids to Phoenix Indian School. They didn't want the two groups of kids who were on opposing sides or whose parents were on opposing sides to be at the same school because they didn't want there to be problems at the behavioral problems at the school. And so the federal government sent Tawakwaptiwa and his wife and another village leader by the name of Frank Siamtiwa, also his wife and children. And this is the photograph that you see. This is of their families. And this, of course, was a photograph that I used as the cover photo of Education Beyond the Mesa. And then Coach Arvis Myron, Hopi coach Arvis Myron, at some point, maybe 10 or so years ago, provided captions on this photograph, which I'm providing for you here to look at. And you know, this is an incredible picture that this is a group of families essentially with their kikmongui, the village chief Tawakwaptiwa in the center. He's in his suit, and the federal government sent their families along with nearly 70 Hopi kids, Hopi boys and girls, to Sherman Institute. One of those people that they sent was my grandfather, Victor Sakayestewa. Others who are well known, especially in Hopi studies and Native studies in general, such as Elizabeth White, Pulangayasi Kwayowahyoma. She had written a biography called No Turning Back about her experience. Also, Don Talayasva, you're familiar with his book, Sun Chief. Okay, so both Talayasva, Kwayowahyoma, and my grandfather Sakayestewa, Victor Sakayestewa, they all went to school to Sherman Institute from 1906 to 1909, and it truly was incredible, I think, because these Hopi kids, they didn't go alone. They actually went to Sherman Institute with leadership from their community, from their village. This was not the norm. I've been looking at the off-reservation Indian boarding school experience for almost 20 years now and studying this. And this was something special here. I think the federal government worked very, very hard to try to make Hopi people to be compliant. And I think the federal government knew that if they could influence one of the village leaders, especially someone like Tawakwaptiwa, and send him to school, then maybe he would be a positive influence to the greater, larger Hopi community when he returned back to Hopi land in 1909. But for these kids to have their village leader at the school present with them, to give them guidance, to give them all guidance, to praise them when they needed to be praised, to get after them when they needed to be get after, that would have been something. And I would imagine that having Tawakwaptiwa and Frank Siamtiwa and also their families and wives there at the school also gave the family of these children, the Hopi children at the school, some comfort. It probably gave them some comfort knowing that their village leadership was with them and accompanying them at that school. You can see here, and I have written down in the Sherman Bulletin. Sherman Bulletin was a student-written newspaper that a lot of the newspaper was actually, the articles and essays were actually written by Native people, Native students themselves. And in April 1907, and this kind of gives you a glimpse a little bit about Tawakwaptiwa and his influence on the Hopi followers, these children from his village at the school. In April 1907, the Sherman Bulletin reported that Tawakwaptiwa frequently called his Hopi followers together to give them good advice. He told the Hopi boys and girls to enter into everything heartily in connection with the school, to secure the best that Sherman had to give. And consequently, the Hopi pupils did not hang back, but pushed rapidly ahead. With great respect for their chief and confidence in his counsel, the Hopi followers listened to Tawakwaptiwa in the same manner as they did at Arabi. This story really is an incredible story. I don't have time to go through it here. I wrote an article for the Journal of American Indian Education. I think I published that back in 2005, and it was titled the Hopi followers, and it was about Chief Tawakwakiwa's influence on the Hopi kids at Sherman Institute from 1906 to 1909. And certainly, if you're continue to be interested in that, you can look at that article, which is on my website, beyondthemesas.com. I have all my articles on the right-hand side of the margin. Or if you have the book, the story about Tawakwaptiwa, and how he led his Hopi followers at Sherman Institute, an institution that government officials intended to destroy Hopi and other Indian cultures. You can find that story in Education Beyond the Mesas in the chapter Elder in Residence, because that's exactly what he was. He was an elder from that community, and he was in residence with his family. At Sherman Institute, the federal government wanted these children to learn about American ways and customs. They wanted these kids to learn about American history, American government, the English language, how to properly construct a sentence or write a letter. A number of these kids, and there's a lot of records about this at the Sherman Museum and the National Archives, of these letters that these kids would write their parents when they were at school, letting them know how they were getting along. And so that accomplished a couple of things. Not only did it accomplish a communication between the students and their parents, but it also helped them in their writing skills and their grammar and their use of the English language. The problem, though, out at Hopi is that these kids would write these letters in English. Many of their parents back home did not speak or read English, and so they relied on missionaries, mostly Mennonite missionaries back in Hopi land in the early 1900s, to take these letters and to translate these letters in their Hopi language. And so, but this was taking place, and what we have a record of these letters, and you want to talk about the Indian voice, right? The Hopi voice. That is certainly a place that I went to quite a bit to be able to get Hopi understandings and how Hopis themselves saw this experience. They're sitting at these desks. You have, of course, this was a very patriotic education that they received. They would have learned the Pledge of Allegiance, some of the common things that take place within our schools today. On the right-hand side of the picture, but on the wall, you can see pictures. Most of those pictures were presidents, United States presidents. And the way that Sherman Institute set up its curriculum, its school day, is that the first half of the school day was spent in the classroom, learning all these various different topics and subject matters. And then the second half, the rest of the day, was spent doing industrial-based education. And that's really important because the federal government had created these off-reservation Indian boarding schools to make Indian workers, right, useful workers in American society. And so they trained them in industrial trades such as blacksmithing, agricultural work, sewing. There's quite a bit of domestic education, what we refer to as domestic training back in the early 1900s for girls. The boys worked in other various different kinds of trades and occupations such as plumbing and electric work. My grandfather, Victor, he worked, he honed some skills in plumbing, and eventually when he left Sherman and later on in life, he was a plumber. That was his profession out at Tuba City. And those are some of the skills that he first learned at Sherman Institute. One of the other things, and there's so many topics. There's just so many topics that I could go through. I'm only touching a little bit of them. Again, you can look at the book, and I've got a lot out there that's been written. I'm only just giving a quick glance at the Hopi boarding school experience at Sherman Institute, but I think one of the more meaningful activities that these kids participated in involved music, and my grandfather played in the Sherman Institute band. I believe that my grandfather is in here somewhere. This would have been the Sherman Institute band around 1907, 1908, around that time. I think it was around 1908. So I know that he played the clarinet. And I think, you know, you could look at that, and maybe some of the clarinet players are off to the left, and so I think he's probably in there somewhere. I don't know exactly where he's at, but his ability to learn music, and you know, to be able to take that later on in life, I think was something very meaningful to him. And of course, these Hopi kids, and just Native kids in general, they came from societies that valued music and dance. They valued music and dance. And for the Hopi kids, not only did they value music and dance, but they also valued hard work, right? And then you could say that with other Native communities as well. And so, you know, a number of these kids were eager to participate in music and join the marching band and play at the football games and other sporting events, and to tour around, right, to various different venues throughout Southern California. And you can imagine that, you know, this allowed these kids to have an outlet, allowed them to do an extracurricular activity. There's quite a bit of mundaneness, if I can use that word, in a school day. And this broke that up. It broke it up, and it allowed them to learn music. And some of this was extremely complicated music, and some of them, such as my grandfather, we use it later on in life. When I was writing my dissertation on this subject at UC Riverside, I had received, and I believe this was in early 2006, I received a phone call, and I think it was a subsequent email from this film director from 716 Productions named Alan, and he had just recently gone out to, his name was Alan Holtzman, and he had just recently gone out to Hopi to visit with the Hopi Culture Preservation Office, because he wanted to do a film on the Hopi boarding school experience at Sherman Institute. And they told him, at least this is my understanding, they said, you know, we have one of our own writing a dissertation on that topic. He's at UC Riverside. They gave him his name. He says, we'll let you film out here and do this film if Matt is an executive producer. He's one of the executive producers. So Alan, he calls me, I have this conversation, he tells me the story. And at first, to be honest with you, I was like kind of taken aback. I'm like, who's this white guy, you know, doing this work on my topic? You know, you get a little, you turf guard a little bit when you spend so much time researching on something. But after I talked with him and I realized he was working with the Hopi Culture Preservation Office, I agreed to work with him. And that was really something, because I never, you know, I was just busy writing my dissertation. I didn't think I was going to produce a film. But I worked with Alan quite a bit on this film. It was called Beyond the Mesas. And we spent a week out at Hopi interviewing various different individuals. A number of them were older individuals. One of the individuals that we visited was Marsa Belenqua. And Marsa, you know, we kind of stumbled on this interview. Marsa was recommended by someone that we had just interviewed in Bakavi, and so they said, you know, there's one individual that you should interview. Her name's Marsa Belenqua, and that name was familiar to me, but I didn't know exactly, you know, where the connection was. And she just lives right over across the street. So me and Alan Holtzman and another individual that constituted the film crew, walked over to Marsa's house, and I told the film crew, I said, you guys stay here in the car. Let me go up and talk to her. And I remembered that there was some family connection that was there on my grandmother's side. And as I approached that door, I knocked on the door, and there was this elderly woman, Marsa, and she came and she answered the door, and I said, I introduced myself to her, and I said, I believe we're related. I said, my grandmother is Ethel Sakayestewa Gilbert from Upper Munkopi. And she says, oh, I know Ethel. Yes, we're related. And so she brought me into her home, and we just visited and talked. And I told her, that we were there to see if she would be willing to be interviewed, and she began to tell me about her Sherman Institute days when she was a young girl, a young woman, and she told me that she had attended Sherman Institute for 13 years during the 1920s, and maybe even into the early 1930s, I think it was, for 13 years without ever going home. And her story was really, really interesting. And I think at the time she was 91, 92 years old. And she was telling me about what it was like to go to Sherman Institute, to leave her family here, and how hard that was for her to do that. And she talked about what it was like to swim in the ocean for the first time, what it was like to experience an earthquake. This is unique. This is a unique Sherman Institute experience that these kids who never experienced something like that, and how terrified she was as this young girl, watching her dorm walls just waving and shaking in an earthquake, and just some incredible stories. And I remember there was a point in the conversation I said, Marsa, I was taking notes. I was just taking notes. I said, I just love these stories. This is just really incredible. I said, but we really, for us to use this as in our film, we've got to be able to record you, film you, tell these stories. And I could tell that Marsa was quiet, and she was contemplated when I said that. And she says, I don't want to be filmed. And I respected that. For as much as I wanted to film her tell these stories, I respected that. I didn't push that. And as I was talking with her, and we were wrapping up our conversation, and I was about to leave, I remember because we were going to stay there a couple more days at a Hopi. And I remember saying to her, I said, Marsa, has your children, your great grandchildren, have they heard these stories before? And she says, no. And I said, if you allow us to record these stories, we'll be able to save these stories for them. Then they'll always have access and be able to learn from your past, your stories that you're sharing with me now. And Marsa thought for a short period of time, and she says, okay, I will do the interview. And so what you have here is Neil's depiction of that as I described it to him, and the interview that took place with Marsa Belinqua. I always refer to her as the star of the film. She really is. And this is one of, just to kind of, I have this quote here, which is great. We were just little kids running around. This is what was life like right before going to boarding school. We were just little kids running around. She describes, just happy kids, she says. One of the perhaps most difficult story that she told was a story about when she left her village, when she left Hopi on the day that she left for school. And she says, she goes, my mother my mother never cried in front of us growing up. I never saw my mother cry. She goes, but I saw my mother cry that day. And here's a depiction of that. You have this old truck, 1920s truck, and you've got these kids who are rounded up, put in the back of out of the truck, and they're heading to California. They're heading to Flagstaff, and then west to California. And if you look closely at this, and I know it's kind of hard to see the details of it, some of the parents are waving. You've got one woman, mother, who's crying. You have some parents who are looking in a different direction because it's just too hard to think about. And the thought and the idea that these kids would be away, and as far as Marsa's story goes, and her experience, she was away for 13 years without ever coming back. And I just can't even imagine that. And there's certainly some positive consequences of going into a new land and school and learning and have new experiences and be able to meet all these various different people. But there's also something to be lost, right? There's something to be gained from this, but there's also something to be lost. And these kids lost out on a lot back in their village communities. These kids didn't have their mothers and fathers, grandmothers, aunties, uncles, these community people with them at the school. Instead, they were replaced by these school matrons who were in charge of like hundreds of kids. And at such a vulnerable time, for these children, some of them as they entered 11, 12, 13 years old, they're starting puberty, they're experiencing puberty. It's a confusing time for them as it is, and they don't have their family to go through that. They don't have the support. I remember doing an interview with Ivan Sidney, former chairman of the Hopi tribe, and he said, as he was reflecting about his Phoenix Indian school experience, he says, we didn't learn parenting at Phoenix Indian School, right? We didn't learn parenting at Phoenix Indian School. And that living history, as Gwan Wasioma talks about, that has a generational effect on families. And you can imagine these kids, there are various different, there's a ceremonial cycle that takes place out at Hopi. They weren't part of that. Surely these kids for the most part, weren't able to go home during their time. Maybe eventually after their school time had expired, they were able to go home. But if they were not physically able to go home, and I write about this in my book, they were mentally able to go home. They thought about home a lot. They knew what time of the year it was. They knew the dances that were taking place. They imagined their grandmothers and their mothers grinding corn. They pictured their fathers out there on the field tending to the field, the corn, the bean, their sheep. They thought about home. They returned home in their thoughts. Of course, some of these kids returned home in a coffin because they died at Sherman Institute, and their parents sent them healthy children, no problems. And some of these kids return home in a coffin. They return home dead. So, there's, as I said, it's a complicated story, and has various layers of meaning. This is a photograph of Hopi girls who belong to the Young Women's Christian Association out at Sherman Institute. This came from the Viva White collection and the Sherman Indian Museum. And there was a lot of Christian type work that took place out at Hopi, and of course it was the hope that these girls and boys too would be exposed to Christianity, the teachings in the Christian Bible, and to be able to take that back to Hopi land. And of course, Christianity had been already long established by the time out at Hopi by the time it gets to the 1920s. Well, when they returned home to a world that in many ways had stayed the same, but they themselves had changed, right? And I remember experiencing this when I went off to college. I felt like everything changed. Everyone changed when I went, when I came back home to Flagstaff. And I remember my mother saying, no, your friends really haven't changed. Those that have stayed here, you're the one that changed. You come with different perspective on life. And, they had to face these challenges of what to do in their next, step in life, whether they work in various trade occupations. Some of them would go back to more traditional Hopi ways of planting and agricultural work. Others would stay in cities. They would stay in Riverside or Los Angeles and work. They would join the military. These boarding schools were very much structured in a military style, where they marched and they had ranks as far as the students could get, and very much structured on a military style, which is coming from Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania. But they had to navigate life, and it was not easy. Elizabeth White talks about this when she went back home, how hard it was. She didn't want to live the Hopi way anymore, because she had gotten accustomed to Western ways of living, to a bed, a nice comfortable bed, running water, electricity. And she went back to a village where they didn't have any of that, not in the way that she experienced it. And she was able to experience seafood. She liked that, and nothing like that existed back in Hopi land. My grandfather, and as we wrap it up here, because I know I'm going a little late, I'm an historian. We can get a little long-winded, and apologize for that. My grandfather he played the clarinet. He learned how to play the clarinet at Sherman Institute, right? He was one of those people in that picture, I think. He went on to join a band that called the Santa Fe All Indian Band. And he used his skills, and he was able to travel all throughout the United States. And there's a picture of him in his band attire in the 1950s. He had the opportunity to play and to travel with the Santa Fe All Indian Band in 1953 to play in Dwight Eisenhower's inauguration, President Eisenhower's inauguration in Washington, D.C. in March. It was a huge honor for him. But that was just one of many ways that he used his experience in his life later on. Well, as I mentioned, and as Annie mentioned, there's this video, and I would really encourage you to get it. It's free, it's online. You can go to Vimeo, and there's the website there, vimeo.com. I'm not going to read all those letters out to you. But maybe this is something too that Annie can send out to folks, those of you who are here, so that you can watch this. It's about 27 minutes long. It's been shown everywhere. One time I was in Minnesota in November, and it was on PBS in the hotel room. I thought that was pretty cool. But the Hopi high school and the elementary, the day schools out there, they use this film, and it's this is why I do this kind of work. And then the last slide that I have here are these books. Of course, you have the one on the left here. And then what stemmed from that was my book on Hopi runners. When I was doing research on education beyond the Mesas, I came across all these documents on Hopi runners, and I was going to write who competed at Sherman Institute. And I was going to write a whole chapter on that, but I decided, no, I'm going to save all that material, and I'm going to write a book about it. And so on the right-hand side, that's the book that I wrote about that. Well, I went almost an hour. I know this usually ends at 12, but I also know that I could take a little bit more time for questions and answer, and I would be happy to field any questions. I may not know the answer, but I'd be happy to hear your feelings, take your questions. Go.
Thank you so much, Matt. Our first question, did Marsa speak of her transition back into Hopi society? Did she continue to speak Hopi? And how were students received by their communities when they returned home? So the first question here from Rachel is, did Marsa speak of her transition back into Hopi society?
Yeah, she did. She did, and others, because we would ask, about that. And, when she left Sherman Institute in the early 1920s and then came back home in the 1930s, she said that she lost her ability to speak Hopi. However, she regained it in not too long of a time because she was surrounded by it, right? The language came back. But it was hard. I think it was really hard for these youth and young people to transition back, and some of them just couldn't bear it. It was just they were so used to a different way of living. They decided to live in the cities. They decided to live in Albuquerque, Phoenix, Los Angeles, and other places. And so it's if I were to look at my grandfather, like he just bounced around after Sherman Institute. He ended up going to, there was another boarding school, I think it's called Greenville Indian School, Northern California. He tried it there. He tried various different occupations. He finally, settled on plumbing. But you're also dealing with a group of people, right, age-wise, where they are restless. So you're dealing with that as well. But that's a really good question. Thank you.
And we've had a couple of requests. If you could go back to the slide with the Vimeo link.
Oh, yeah. There it is. I'll keep that up so people can look at it.
Fantastic, thank you. And I will include that in the follow-up email, as well as links to your books. And also the last lecture that you gave for us back in September of 2020. I will also include that link. The next question. Your presentation seems very positive regarding education offered at the Sherman Institute. The person who's asking the question has had very different feedback from Native children attending the Phoenix Indian School. Was Sherman Institute different from other schools in the US? And don't you think this was part of the acculturation process?
Yeah, no, well, I think that's a good point. Robert Trenner in his book on the Phoenix Indian School really speaks at length of some of the harsh treatment that Indian students had, including Hopi students, right? Some of these kids just hated the superintendent, some of the rules and breaking of rules and the consequences that resulted in that. And so certainly, that's part of it. This is, the idea that school officials would be actively attempting to eliminate, suppress, destroy an Indian student's culture is horrifying, right? There's no, and these officials, these superintendents, they thought that they were helping these Native students, right? And so certainly there's that. There's loss of culture. Samuel Shingoitiwa, one of the individuals that I had interviewed for my dissertation, he talked about how he broke some infractions, some rules, and he broke some rules at Sherman Institute, and he was treated like a prisoner. They had a place, at Sherman Institute that kids who had gotten in trouble would stay at, and he ran away. He was just like, forget this, I'm going home. So he hitched a ride on a train, and he eventually made it back home, right? And so there are these moments of resistors, and I talk about this in my book about runaways who left. So that's a really excellent point. There was some good superintendents and some bad superintendents, and typically the schools tended to follow depending on the leadership.
Our next question, she says, I visited the Arabi village with a Hopi guide a few years ago, and I'm trying to imagine what it was like when children were sent away. During those years, were there no school-age children at all in the village?
Were there no school-age children at the village?
Yes, that's the question.
There certainly was. There were day schools at the village. I'm going to try to get back into this. There were day schools. There's a Arabi day school. There's various different day schools out of Hopi land, and these day schools tended to be feeder schools to the off-reservation Indian boarding schools. So at a certain age, these kids would be sent off to Sherman Institute. At Carlisle Indian Industrial School, some of these kids were as young as 4 or 5 years old. And most of the kids at Sherman Institute, who typically would have gone to Sherman at this time, we're talking maybe middle school age kids, high school age kids, a little bit older, although certainly there were young children there as well. I mean, you have an 11-year-old trying to navigate life 600 plus miles away without parents, without community. That must have been extremely frightening in many ways, but also extremely difficult. So that's a great question.
At what age would a child be able to leave school, and how long were the children required to stay at Sherman?
So originally, this first group of students, this large group of students, they were there from 1906 to 1909. A number of left to 1909. They could request to stay longer if they wanted to. It all kind of depended on when they started and at what age they started. Sometimes, there was this one student, I can't remember exactly who it is. He had left. He was a Hopi student. He had left Sherman because his time had run out, so he was no longer there. But he wanted to go back to Sherman Institute. And the way he got back to Sherman Institute was that he wrote superintendent, I believe he was superintendent consort at Sherman, a letter, and he said to them, he wrote and said that he really could use more education. He really could use more training in school. As just look at my handwriting, look at my grammar on this letter. I really need to come back. So you did have students too who even after they left wanted to come back or transfer to another school. Some of these students who started at Sherman went to Haskell Institute in Kansas.
The next question, were all the students at Sherman Hopi, or were there young people from other nations there?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, there was a large group of them from Hopi, right? But they also had Navajo students. They had some of the students from the Pueblo communities in New Mexico that were there. They had some California Indian students there as well. And so when the school opened in 1902, up until about the 1940s, I think about the 1940s and then into the 1950s, there was a big mix of students, right, that were there, and it really kind of reflected the region. So you had various different Indian tribes, Native nations who were being represented at Sherman, who were in close proximity, right, on the western side of the United States. Whereas Haskell maybe got more of the Central America Native communities, and then you make your way east eventually to Carlisle. Carlisle had a large Lakota and Dakota population there at that time. So it kind of depended on where you were. So by the 1940s, though, there was this program called the Navajo program. It was a 5-year Navajo program, and for that period of time, it was only Navajo students who went there, and that was replicated at other boarding schools as well.
Do many Hopi speak their native language currently? And is there a way for them to learn it if they do not speak it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I always say that Hopi is like a lifelong goal for me, right? Learning a little bit at a time. And there's still people that speak the language. You can go out to Hopi and hear people talking in the Hopi language. But this is, I think this has been a struggle. It's been a consequence of the boarding school experience and just colonization in general, right? And but we've got people who are working to bring that back and to teach. People like Sheila Nicholas here at the University of Arizona. She's done incredible work on language revitalization, Hopi language revitalization. And I believe that teachers at the Hopi schools are also teaching kids the Hopi language to a certain degree, right? Having them become familiar with words and certain words and sayings and expressions.
And our last question, the initial photo that you showed of the Institute looks like a foreshadowing of World War II. And you've been asked if, was the Institute structured like the German nationalist schools were structured? And she also says that one of her aunts is a survivor of the Holocaust.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I don't really know the answer to that question. I do know that these schools were structured as military institutions. And it goes back to the founding of the first off-reservation Indian boarding school, Carlisle Indian Industrial School, that Richard Henry Pratt established. Of course, he was in the military, and he had a very regimented, very military-like structure to these schools. And so, this would have been the morning roll call. Sometimes they would have larger Sunday roll calls. The students would have been dressed in military attire. They would have had patriotic. The band would have been up there. They would have been marching in formation and to teach these kids discipline and structure. But at the same time, the hope, as far as administrators go, is that these Indian students would also be taught patriotism, at least to a certain degree. And so you hear of that when I interview people about their boarding school days during this time period or this era, they always talk about the military structure of the school. This is Spanish Spanish mission style buildings that you see here at Sherman Institute. Those buildings are long gone. They were the earthquake hazard in the 1970s. The Bureau of Indian Affairs knocked them all down.
I'm going to slip in one last question, if I may. Carlene says, I believe my father did not teach us, his children, our language as a form of protection. What do you think about this?
Well, I've heard that. I've heard that from other people before, and I think that I think that certainly we can, in 2022, we can look at that and be somewhat critical of that, right? That decision. But I also think that you have a parent, whether it's a father or mother or extended family member, who at that moment is trying to make the best, to make a decision that's in the best, what they believe is in the best interest of their daughter or their son, right? And maybe what was happening in the world and at that time, or within Indian country at that time, that was the best thing. And so, I mean, I am grateful though that there are an older generation of Hopi individuals who continue to speak Hopi, and maybe that was their opinion 30, 40, 50 years ago, but they're now trying to teach their great grandchildren the Hopi language so that would continue on. That's a great observation and question.
Thank you so much for your time today, Matt. We truly appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you very much. It looks and it was a thrill to once again be a speaker for Amerind, and thank you all. This is a Saturday morning, afternoon, and you're here on this Zoom call, so I thank you. Wow.
And I'm so sorry to all those folks who we were not able to get to your questions. Again, we will be sending out a link to this video, as well as his previous video with Amerind, his books, a link to Beyond the Mesas. So be on the lookout for that in your inbox. And thanks to everyone who joined us today. And we hope that you can join us again on Saturday, October 8th for our flute performance with Vince Redhouse. Have a good day, everyone. Bye.